Good morning, everyone. So now we are live. This recording will be provided to everyone after the course today. My name is Matthias Carlson. I'm going to do the course today together with Mo. I'll cover the theory part, and then Mo has put together a really good group of exercises that we'll do at the end of the course. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. The first thing I'll go ahead and do is to just go through some general information about the course. So very briefly, it's a half-day course. It will probably take somewhere between 3 and 4 hours. We'll try to have breaks where that's natural. We want it to be interactive, so if you have any questions, feel free to either unmute or ask in the chat box down to the right. All the material, some of it was provided yesterday. We'll resend it out after the course. The material is essentially the slide deck that we're going through today, the recording, and also the paper that we've actually written with a lot of you guys in the audience today on comparing different bottom pressure correlations to real gauge data. So that's actually been a part of the consortium and the work that we've been doing together with the community the last year here. We're super excited about going through some of those findings as well. I think we delivered that paper for URTEC this year less than a week ago, so that's awesome. Some of the slides you'll see, they're really busy. I don't really like busy slides, but they're meant more for reference than for me to actually go through it in the course, but they're good to have for later. Also more detailed information about the different correlations and stuff we've actually put into the appendix this year for people who are more interested in knowing more about the specific correlations, but we'll hopefully give you all a pretty good high-level view of the bottom hole pressure correlations. What's different between them, what is similar, what do we actually mean by this group of correlations that we're using primarily in tight unconventionals, etc. Hopefully all of you have been able to log into courses.whitson.com, so that's where we're going to do the exercises today. So very important at this point, go to courses.whitson.com and not your company domain. Everybody in the course here works for a company that has Whitson Plus access, but the domain that we're going to use today is a domain designed for the exercises and stuff that we're going to do today, and also not to clutter up the domain that you do day-to-day working. Make sure that you go to courses.whitson.com. So that will be a domain that looks like this. And in that domain, we're going to use, I see all the private projects here, but there should be a field called BHP course 2024. So when you get into courses.whitson.com, you logged in, you click that button right there. So to be able to log in, we'll give everybody a few minutes here. Just make sure that you include the HTTPS before here, else you'll not find the domain. The username should be your email, and the password should be Whitson bottom hole pressure or Whitson BHP 2024. Mo, can you just for simplicity also provide this password in the chat? Yeah. Thanks.
If anyone has any issues, just send an email to support@whitson.com or just type it in the chat and I'll help with the login.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're not able to log in, so we create like, I don't know, 140 people who signed up for the course or something. So we do that with code. So if typically it's me being very bad at like communicating one of the people who registered to the rest of the group. So you can blame me if you're not able to log in. But take a couple of minutes there. So just make sure that you're logged in. Once you've logged in, click this picture that has the front slide basically of the course today called BHP course 2024, and you should be able to get into this part right here, which is showing the different projects. And there you'll see your project that only you will see. I see, Mo and I have been creating different projects and stuff, so I see those there. But you should see your project where you are a project owner, and you can go in and click there. And the rest of the information Mo will provide when we get to the exercise part. But at this point, if you would like to do the exercises, please make sure that you have logged in to the software using your email and the password provided on the slide. And the domain we're going to use is courses.whitson.com, not your own company domain. very important, else you'll not be able to do the exercises. The first part of the course today, I'm going to go through the agenda. That's going to be related to theory, bottom hole pressure calculation fundamentals. At least I don't know how other companies are doing it or software vendors, but that's a thing at Whitson that we would like you to know some of the important theory and then put it into practice in the same course. So that's kind of how we're trying to design all of these courses that we're doing throughout the year. So on the theory side, we're going to cover why we calculate bottom hole pressures in the first place. What are the inputs to bottom hole pressure calculations? What different correlations do we actually have available in Whitson Plus, and what makes them unique and potentially different from each other? We'll talk about something that's very important inputs, which is the flow paths and artificial lift methods, and how that impacts the bottom hole pressure calculations. We'll also talk about BHP smoothing and BHP tuning, and at the end we'll talk very briefly on how you can use early time bottom hole pressure data to estimate the initial reservoir pressure with an IPR technique, and I think Mo will also cover that in exercises. And then the last part, which will actually be the majority of the part today, is the exercises. So as you know, some of the courses throughout the year, this is part of a 7 series of courses. Some of the courses are a little bit more theory heavy, some of them are a little bit more exercise heavy. This is probably, or definitely, one of those that are more exercise heavy. So the theory will just be a little hour here, I think, and then we'll take a break and then go to the exercise. So just to put like bottom hole pressures into like the in context for why we need it. If you, for instance, look at the unconventional reservoir workflow, it's kind of this natural next step to do after you've defined the PVT for a well. Because you need bottom hole pressure for so many different things, you need it for RTA, PTA, you need it for numerical reservoir simulation, nodal, production diagnostics, etc., etc. So it's a long list. So and it's an input to so many different types of work, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It's even an implicit input to when you do DCA fits. So we'll if that's doesn't click, then we'll cover that as well. In Whitson Plus, we offer 4 different correlations. They are actually calculated all at the same time, and you'll see that those correlations will be provided to you in this bottom hole pressure plot right here. That's very characteristics of Whitson Plus. So this is not like oil, gas, water, and GOR over time. This is just Beggs & Brill, Hagedorn, Brown, Voldemort, and Gaillard and Gray over time. We'll talk about why they are almost overlapping early time, for instance, in this plot, and why they spread late time. We'll talk about the study where we've compared these to over 300,000 data points of gauge pressure for more than 420 wells, a database that we're continuously updating. We're of course going to show you how to run this in the software. But that's been the thing for us that we have spent a lot of time on, is to kind of challenge the industry consensus of what correlation to use when. And that's also why it's very important as a part of the workflows that we talk about, that we calculate all of them at the same time, so that you as the end user actually know what are the difference in the different calculated properties here from the different correlations, and then you pick one where you hopefully have done a little bit of investigation work of which ones you should use and make that basin-specific standard or not. When you talk about a bottom hole pressure, it's very important that you define kind of a datum of the bottom hole pressure, right? Should the datum be at the end of tubing? Should it be at the top perforation? Should it be at the bottom perforation, somewhere in the middle, etc.? What we do in Whitson Plus is that we define the sand phase pressure, so like the sand phase bottom hole pressure. We define that to be the pressure at the top perforation. And the reason for that is, if you didn't do it, you would have to have a complicated nodal model that shows you what is the flow throughout the lateral portion, because the only place where you actually are honoring the material balance 100% would be at the top perforation. So that's why we do it, and also you can convince yourself that this is a very good approximation, because as we'll talk a lot about, the main call it or dominating effect for pressure drops in these tight unconventionals is gravity driven. So as soon as you get into the horizontal, the delta P's that you're talking about, they will be very, very small, because if you compare these rates to, for instance, offshore wells where you produce 50,000 barrels per day, where friction can be super important, etc., these are on a relative basis actually relatively low rates, so become very, very gravity driven pressure drops. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But for you, it's very important that the datum, when you're seeing the calculated properties, the software, where you've put in a well deviation survey and a perforated interval, the reference point for the bottom hole pressure calculation is at this top perf. So this number right here is what dictates what is the the MD of the what you call the sand phase pressure. That is very important. And this is also the interface we'll talk more about later, where you provide the well deviation survey, so MDs and TVDs. Perfect. A natural place to start when we do this course is like, okay, why do we calculate bottom hole pressures in the first place? And for a tight unconventional, I think that the value add is supernatural, right? And the simple answer is that for most wells, we don't have gauge pressures. And even if we had gauge pressures, the gauge is typically not at sand phase. You would have to do a correction from the gauge depth down to sand phase anyways. So every single well, if you want to kind of do the extreme thing, whether you have a gauge or not, at the limit, every single shale well or well, I guess, needs to have calculations of bottom hole pressure. So that's why it becomes natural to talk about. And it's also something that you kind of would like to have evergreen, and something that you would like to update every single day. And the reason why bottom hole pressure in particular is so important is that it's an input to so many different types of analysis. Just to give you, a sense of some of them, for instance, when you do decline curve analysis and you do a fit, if you want that fit to be representing something physical, you actually you're actually assuming that your bottom hole pressure is constant. So if you're fitting DCA parameters while the bottom hole pressures are changing as crazy, they will actually not represent anything physical. Then your B factors, etc., can be all over the place. So it's implicit in DCA. You need it as a direct input in a flow material balance exercise, RTA, numerical models, nodal, production data diagnostic dashboards, just comparison plots of rate normalized pressure, pressure normalized rates. If you want to do like flow material balance comparison plots, etc. So very, very prolific, I guess, type of data set that we need as an input to a wide range of different engineering analysis. And that's why it's so important to have this course. And I think looking at the courses this year, it's definitely one of the more popular courses that people sign up for, because it's so relevant for production engineers, people doing reserves, people more on an asset level, reservoir engineers, production engineers, general petroleum engineers, exploitation engineers, etc. So it has a really, really big playing field, which is great. Two bottom hole pressure calculations are three things, or three groups of things, I guess. The first thing, you need your production data. So you need your surface rates at stock tank conditions. So that's oil, gas, and water. So of course, for a dry gas well, there's no liquids, so that will be just gas and water. You also need the pressures and also temperature. But most importantly here is your casing and tubing pressure and how they vary over time. Wellhead temperature are typically assumed to be constant. It's not just like for reservoir temperature. If you compare reservoir temperature to initial reservoir pressure, like initial reservoir pressure is way more important than at least on a relative basis than initial reservoir temperature. And it's the same thing for this. So you need production data, that's rates and pressures over time. The second thing you need is the wellbore trajectory. You need to know what the deviation survey is. So that's just measured depths versus true vertical depths. And you also need to know what is the top and bottom perforation. So in Whitson Plus, Mo will show you this later. When you input the data, you can very quickly just plot this plot right here, and you see what the vertical part is, and you also see the perforator interval here in blue. The last thing that you need is what we call wellbore configuration data or well completion data, and that can change over time. So that will be what are the casing and tubing diameters and what you call depths. So where are they actually set? So typically for tubing, we talk about what's end of tubing depth, the EOT here. Very, very common abbreviation called end of tubing depth. That is used in the context of these calculations. And that's kind of the last family of inputs here to the calculation, and it can change over time. So initially you can just flow through casing, then you can flow through tubing, then maybe gas lift is installed, maybe rod pump is after that. So there can be multiple of these over time. Doesn't change every day, but maybe you have, you know, everything from 2, 3 to maybe 7, 8 changes like that really matters over time that you would like to capture, and that will affect the bottom hole pressure calculation. So to sum up, you need production data, and so that's rates and pressures. You need the well deviation survey and the perforated interval, and you need this well configuration data. So how does the well actually look like in the sizes of the casing and the tubing and their depth. So I think that's simple. So if you've done this before, so far so good. But that's the inputs. So when you do these exercises inside of Whitson Plus, that Mo is going to show you later. You know, when you're inside of the bottom hole pressure feature right here, all these inputs, except from rates and pressures, they will be possible to edit inside of this well data card right here that Mo will kind of loop you through later. So this is the deviation survey, and this is the wellbore data right here. The next thing we're going to talk about is, okay, that's the inputs, but how do we actually calculate the sand phase pressure with different correlations? And the sand phase pressure can be calculated with so-called correlations. We have BHP correlations. And when we talk broadly about at least a family of BHP correlations we're talking about, they're using a very similar equation, and they have some slight differences that we'll also talk about. But BHP calculations in general that we are going to talk about, they rely on using single-phase flow equations to model multi-phase flow. Okay, so oil and water, they're typically lumped together into a single liquid phase, and then liquid and gas are averaged into a single phase mixture. And this averaging is what is correlation dependent. Okay, so this is a very important piece, and it's going back to like, okay, why were these correlations basically the same initially, and then the spread was bigger later? And I'll ask that question just openly, and you can think about it, but it's related to some of the things we talk about here. The correlations that's available in the software, and that we support, that is Hagen & Brown, it's Beggs & Brill, it's Gray, and it's Voldis Mayart and Gaillard. And I probably butchered all these names, but I can blame that I'm Norwegian, so I don't have to be perfect with my pronunciation. But in general, this family of models are called drift flux models, okay? And they're preferred due to their simplicity. So they're an alternative to the a more complicated method, which would be to solve the full momentum and energy equations for each of the phases separately. And that's what you typically hear about as a mechanistic model. Okay, so that none of these are so-called mechanistic models. And then you have transient models that's more complicated than that again. But as you'll see, these are very functional, practical, and they are actually accurate enough for the engineering exercises that we're dealing with, at least the ones that I'm exposed to, and we can look at how accurate they are a little bit later. The equation looks a little bit scary, looks like this, and you know, maybe you guys you breed equations for lunch or eat them for lunch, but this gives me a little bit of headaches back to school, gonna be honest with you. But if you break it down a little bit, you'll see that the delta P, so the pressure drop, is caused by 3 different forces. It's the gravity, which is the most dominant. It is in absolutely most of the cases that we're dealing with. And that is caused by the weight of the fluids, and it acts in the direction of gravity. Simple to understand. And if you actually look at this, you see the cos thing, that's probably just related to the deviation on the wellbore, etc. But gravity, everybody understands that gravity is important for when it comes to pressure. That's one piece of it. And then the second thing that I think also a lot of people have a relationship to is friction. And friction is caused by the pipe wall, okay? So the tubing casing pipe wall, the roughness. And then the last thing, the last piece here, typically not very important at all for most cases, and it's called acceleration. And that's caused by a rapid expansion of fluids, and it will only be relevant for gaseous wells near the wellhead for low wellhead pressures. Okay, so late life, low pressures for more gassy wells. Then to something very important, because this is the general kind of governing equation that's actually the same for all the four correlations that we talked about. Basin-Brill, Hagen-Brown, Gray, Voldesmar, and Gaillard. So when it comes to the differences between the different correlations, one thing that's important to understand is if I took an example, and I'll show you an example here, where I've done bottom hole pressure calculations, and what I did was that I removed the oil and the gas rates from the inputs to the correlation, and I ran the bottom hole pressure calculation. If I did that, so just assuming single phase water, you will not see any differences between the correlations because they will be identical. So actually in this this case right here, this is only water. You have Basin-Brill, Hagen and Brown, Voldesmar, Gaillard, and Gray. They were on top of each other. And you see gray color because that's on top of the other one, hides the other one. So all the correlations overlap if you're dealing with single phase flow, okay, single phase water in this case. Or if you did the same for a gas, exactly the same thing. And this brings us into what is different between the different correlations. Okay, so if you go back and look at this common equation that we talked about, that is common for all the correlations, this pressure gradient equation. Right here, we've just taken the equation you saw 2 slides ago and just rewrote it a little bit, but it's the same terms. And the difference between the correlations lies in how the correlation calculates something called liquid holdup. And that will only be relevant if you actually have liquid and gas in the wellbore at the same time. And that affects some of the properties in the pressure gradient equation. So gravity density, the multiphase friction factor, friction density, and the acceleration density. Okay, but probably the gravity density, intuitively, I think, is the one that will have the biggest impact. So that's the difference. And liquid holdup, if you don't know what it is, it's defined here on this slide, and it just represents the part of the pipe cross-sectional area that's occupied by fluid. Okay, so you take the liquid area and you divide by the total area, basically. So you see that in the picture to the left. Okay, so that's the difference. So now hopefully we've come so far that everybody knows here that you know, if you're dealing with a dry gas well that only produces gas, all the correlations should be the same. So saying that, for instance, gray is the best correlation for a gas well, like that, it can't be true because like all the correlations will give you the same answer. Okay, when you start to get liquids in there, that's something different. But for a pure single phase liquid, it will yield exactly the same result. This leads us to the most natural next question. Which BHP correlation is the most accurate? So that was the second thing we sent out yesterday, where we sent out the URTEC paper. One of the 2 URTEC papers we're presenting at URTEC now in June. And it was a very comprehensive BHP study where the objective was to compare measured gauge pressures versus correlations. We had a data set of around 600 wells, and 420 of them passed the QC. And total, we were looking at more than 300,000 data points. So starting to get kind of statistically significant when you look at that many data points. And the basins that were represented, that's also important because I think some of this stuff is a little bit basin specific. That's something we want to break down in the further study. But we looked at, we had data from Delaware, Midland, DJ, Powder River, Anadarko, and Utica. And kind of to just jump to the conclusion here, if I took all the data points and I looked at the median error and the distribution of the errors in an absolute form, like how much were you off on an absolute basis in PSI. So I'm looking at PSI. We could see that Basin-Brill was consistently over-predicting. Hagen and Brown was slightly under-predicting. Voldesmar and Gaillard was the best, but very close to Hagen and Brown, slightly over-predicting. And then Gray was under-predicting a little bit on average for a wide range of fluids. And we also did this for like on a if you wanted to look at the relative error as well. So you can read all the details about this in the paper. But you like the median error was around 5 plus minus 5%, which is kind of pretty good. And then and that's for Hagen and Brown and Voldesmar and Gaillard, and then Basin-Brill and Gray. They were systematically a little bit more off on this data set. What we also wanted to see in the study on these wells was to see, okay, is there any like relationship to the producing GOR and the relative error. We looked at that because it's producing GOR and also producing GLR actually, and you can see both the plots and the paper there. The gray bars behind the plot here is just indicating how many data points we had in each of these buckets. So you see we have much more data for low GOR, or 40,000 GOR is not low. So like relatively low GOR, liquid rich data. We have a lot of data in that pool, and then a little bit less on the higher end, and that's just because the more gassy your well is, the less money you have to do science like this. That's just how it is in today's environment when it comes to commodity prices. But we want to expand on getting more data on this region, of course, later. But not super big differences with fluid types. I think there is a break, some kind of break with Hagen and Brown for very high gas liquid ratios where it starts to perform really bad. But we couldn't really find any systematic, at least from the data set we had, that just based on fluid type alone or producing GOR or GLR, that one correlation did so much better for one particular part of fluid versus another. So as you'll read in the paper, we don't say that go and use Voldemort and Gaillard blindly, even though it performed the best. What we're saying is there is an industry consensus that says that you should use Hagen and Brown for oils, Gray for gases, and Bakes for liquid-rich wells. And we're trying to just challenge that industry consensus. And I think that the calculations show that that industry consensus is at best naive, and that you should, if you have gauges available, compare your bottom of pressure data, calculations to the gauge data when you have that available, and then use whatever is the most accurate correlation for the wells in that basin. Maybe even tune them, that Mo will talk about a little bit later. And if you don't have any gauge data, at least what I do and what we kind of recommended from the study is that, okay, then you use the recommendation in the paper and probably default to using Voldemort and Gaillard if you don't have any other information. But do that investigation work. You have gauges to get comfortable on what correlations you use on other wells in the basin. And I know a lot of you have done this already. If you haven't done it, it is a huge ROI thing. And I think like if you have a basin with a ton of wells and not a gauge pressure, let's get it on one well or two wells so that you can get a feeling for this, because you would like the bottom of pressure correlation that you're using to be the most accurate one. I think there's a lot of value to be captured there. When it comes to the study, there's a lot of future work items. We want to break it up by basin. We want to have more data in the study, etc. So our goal is to also present kind of a phase 2 for the study next year. And it's a really, really big data set. And if you compare the number of data points to like the classical papers on this, it's like probably an order of magnitude more data points. So that's something that is pretty cool. And thanks for all of you guys that provided feedback and whatnot throughout the work on the paper.
Yes,
again,
I think there's a question about the producing GOR in the previous slide. If you could clarify what that is specifically when you talk about producing GOR, how if it's per data point, if it's equal to the GORI of a given well, or
that's great. So it's so producing GOR is what producing GOR or is a strict definition of producing GOR. So it's not what it is initially, because over time you can have a low producing GOR to a high producing GOR. But of course, if you have an oil well that starts at 1,000, maybe goes up to 3,000, 4,000 over time, something like this. But that's strictly the producing GOR. So per data point, per day. So that will change per day. And that's how you need to think about bottom of pressure calculations, in my opinion, because it's an experiment every single day that you're dealing with, and what's relevant for that calculation that day is whatever the relative ratios is that day. And of course, if you're dealing with the lower band of producing GORs, you'll naturally be in the lower band, etc. So it'll be some general trends like that. I don't see this the chat box, so it's great that you stopped me there, Mo.
Also, maybe Matthias, if you could just touch upon like Voldemort and Gaillard, what it is. I think a lot of people haven't heard of it before. Just touch upon that and remind people of that. That would be great.
So Voldemort and Gaillard is kind of the newest correlation. It was presented in 2006 and in either a JPT or an SBE paper there. We actually looked at the wide range of flow regimes and fluid systems and stuff and tried to kind of cherry pick and come up with a correlation that worked really well in all conditions. But a very similar kind of regression exercise like the other correlations, but kind of using a lot of the learnings that we have from Hoggett and Brown was from the 60s or 70s, so been 50 years kind of between those, or 40, 50 years between those two. I think for some of you that use some of the other products, it's kind of I think it has some similarities to like PETX 2, PETX 5, if you guys have ever used Prosper products, and it's just the newest one of the correlations that we deal with. And also in the appendix, if you would like to know exactly the details of the different correlations, there is a correlation piece here going through the different, at least the high-level items of Hoggett and Brown, and also when it comes to Bakes and Brill, and then it kind of walks through Bakes and Brill and Gray, and then last one is Voldsmart and Gray. And it's just based on a very extensive review of the correlations and data for inclined pipe flow. We got this recommended actually by one of our associate consultants, who also is a professor in production engineering from NTNU, to incorporate this, Milan Stanko. So we incorporate that based on his recommendation probably a couple of years ago. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about flow paths. So flow paths will be, no matter what correlation you're using, you need to be able to honor the correct flow path. So that's kind of like something you would like to spend a little bit of time on, making sure you actually honor the correct flow paths over time. There's a few options in the software that we'll go through now, and those options, they're provided here. And so when you add a configuration, you need to define a flow path that given day, and we'll talk about what those different flow paths mean. So we'll talk about casing, tubing, analysts, tubing and analysts, measured gauge pressures, and the unknown option, what they actually mean. So that's what we're going to do in this section. When we talk about flow paths and we're talking about casing, it's either of these setups. So if we have casing flow, but we don't have a gauge installed, we'll calculate the pressure drop from the top perf all the way up to wellhead. If we're dealing with a situation where we have a gauge installed, like we have here, there's just a pressure drop from the perf to the gauge that we're adding, okay? Because we measure the pressure here. So that's our pressure source right there. Right? With tubing, it just means that now we have a pipe within the pipe, as I call it. So we have a tubing installed inside of the casing. That's different from what we had earlier, except for that is very, very similar. There's a pressure drop from the top perf, go into the tubing, and all the way up to the wellhead. If you had a gauge installed, here is just an example at end of tubing. It's a delta P until the end of tubing, in this case, or where the gauge is installed, and that's it. Annular flow, now we're starting to get a little bit complicated. So that means that we actually have a tubing installed, but we do not flow up the tubing, but we flow up the annulus. Good example of that is when you do, for instance, reverse gas lift. You actually inject gas through the tubing and produce up the annulus. A good example of that. And in that case, there's a pressure drop to basically where the annulus starts, and then you're flowing just up the annulus here on the sides. But for a gauge, it's just a delta P from the top perf to the gauge, if you have a gauge installed. And we go through this systematically, and also showing you how it looks like in the software when you have this thing ticked off. So if you have a gauge and you want to convert from the gauge to sand phase, you need to have this switch here switched on. Then we have a little bit of an advanced method. That's what we call co-flow, and that's where you have tubing already installed, but you produce up the annulus and tubing at the same time. Very common operationally. Why people do this is so they don't have to go and intervene and put in a tubing later. So they know that at some point they'll need to tube up the well. So they just do this kind of preparation work from day one, produce up the casing or the annulus and tubing from day one, and then after a while they switch it off to tubing only. So it's more of an operational thing, at least what I've been told. So to do this, you just calculate the pressure profile, or the software does this for you, and the tubing, annulus and tubing, and then you check if the pressure at the end of tubing from each calculation is equal for a specific split of the flow, and if not, you change the split and you go to number one. So you, of course there need to be the be the same. Then we have a option where you basically say, I would like to use the measured BHP instead of any calculation. What that means is that if you have inputted a gauge pressure, that can be, some of you guys just want to use the gauge pressure directly, or you have calculated bottom pressures in another tool, and you just would like, for a part of the subsection, some people use like AI models and machine learning to calculate bottom pressures, and you just want in that period to echo whatever the bottom pressure is, then you can go and use that option called measured BHP, that flow path right there, and it would literally just echo the provided pressure. Nothing will be done. The last one is the flow path unknown. That's very popular among the community that does more of the API connections for hundreds and hundreds of wells, especially in cases where you don't really know the flow path on all of those wells. So it's a very good initial guess. It was suggested by Devin a few years ago, probably 2 years ago. So we implemented it based on that, and we see that it is used a lot. And what the software does is that it looks at the casing and the tubing pressures and whether tubing is installed or not to estimate what the flow path is. So if the flow path or if the casing pressure is larger than the tubing pressure and tubing is installed, tubing flow is assumed. And if the casing pressure is less or equal to the tubing pressure and tubing is installed, we assume annular flow. And if the tubing is not installed, we assume casing flow. So that's the unknown option, which could be very, very powerful, especially if you do this exercise on a wide range of wells. That would definitely be my recommendation for API projects to save a lot of time. A other thing that is relevant here is that you can calculate the bottom pressure both on the what's called the flowing side and the quiet side. So we'll talk quickly about what the quiet side is. So the quiet side calculation assumes that you have a tubing installed in the wellbore, and it's also assumed that the annulus is filled with a single phase fluid that has communication to the flowing side at the end of tubing. So there's no isolation packer, and then you could simply just compute the bottom pressure by splitting the pressure drop into two parts. Part number one will just be regular. It will be kind of the same as you would do if you had a gauge here, just a pressure drop from the top perf to wherever this quiet side or the tubing, the end of tubing is, and then there you just calculate a static fluid column from end of tubing to wellhead. The times when you can do this, you need to be aware of when you can do this, because the fundamental assumption is that you have a single phase fluid in the annulus, and there should be no packer installed in the well. So there needs to be communication to the flowing side at the end of tubing. And people do this because it's less noisy. So you'll see in the cases where it works, it will give you similar results, but it will be typically way less noisy. And I think Mo will go through an example of this in the exercises as well. So what scenarios can this really be relevant? I guess if you have a very low GOR oil well, where you can basically assume that there's a single phase quote unquote liquid in the annulus, can be a good example. I think the gas lift system, where you have gas in the annulus, could be another one. Or close to a dry gas well, where essentially you can assume that the annulus is filled with gas only. So those would be typical examples where I see at least the clients are using it. And this is just an example of how it works if you have these quiet side calculations done for gas lift wells, where you actually have the valve. So then you compute the pressure drop from top perf to the valve, and then you basically do the single phase calculation from there and up in number 2 here. So that's a good example, and probably I think Mo mentioned that probably the best example in his head. So that's correct. Are we going through a quick exercise on this, Mo, in the exercises? Yeah. Perfect.
Covering that, and that's as you said, like what I think is that if you have a well on gas lift, that's the only way that you're really sure that the annulus is is single phase gas, at least down to the gas lift valve. So there you can safely use the quiet side calculation.
Second to last thing we're going to cover on the theory part is what the artificial lift methods we support. And we support gas lift, ESP, rod pump, and plunger. For gas lift, there's 3 different options. Pour buoy, which assumes that you have injection at the end of tubing. You can actually put in the valves, then injection through the first valve that is based on the surface pressures that you provide. Or we have an option called automatic. We'll talk about what that means, but we'll go through this systematically. This is the option of we have gas lift, pour buoy style, which means that you don't have any valves in the tubing. But so this is the regular way of doing it, where you inject gas through the annulus and you produce up the tubing, all the way to the end of tubing. That's where you produce it. Another way would be the reverse way of doing it, which was what I mentioned earlier, where you inject through the annulus. Inject through the tubing and produce up the annulus. So that's the reverse gas lift. If you have valves, then you can actually input the valve depths and the PSOs and PSCs, so that's the pressure surface open and close, that surface. That's provided in a gas lift installation sheet. And hopefully everybody here has seen one of those, but gas lift sheet. I'll just show a quick example of that if you haven't seen it. That's just for your own learning. This is standard data that you get from the vendors. So that would look something like this, and you would have PSO and PSC right here, and then you would have the depths over here. So that's the relevant information you need in that particular example. The automatic option is perfect also for these API connections, because typically the valve data is in spreadsheets, or you haven't databased it, or sometimes you have bought a company and you didn't get the valve information, so you don't know anything about the valve information. So then you know you're not using pour buoy, but you don't have the valves. So what are you doing? Well, in that case, you use automatic. And it's brilliant because it checks what the pressure drop is in the tubing side and the casing side at the same time, finds out where they're equal, and that's where it assumes the gas lift to be injected. It won't be perfect if you actually have the valves there, but it will be much better than assuming the pour buoy. Okay, so that's the 3 cases that we have: pour buoy, valves, or automatic. And all of them have their, especially automatic is super popular among the gas lift folks. Rod pump, that's the third. No, we haven't done ASP. So that's the second thing I'll go through here. Requires that you have a liquid level put in. Okay, so you need to have put in a liquid level in the production data. And the pressure drop is calculated in 3 parts. Regular pressure drop from the top perf to the end of tubing. From the end of tubing and up to the liquid level, it's assumed a static column of liquid and gas. And from number 3 and up to surface right here, it's just assumed to be single phase gas flow. If you have an ESP, it's very important to emphasize that when you have an ESP, calculating the ESP pressures is not possible, because there's an additional delta P across the ESP itself that you can model with these correlations. The lucky part is that for an ESP you actually have the pump intake pressures, so you would just calculate from that and down to the sand phase. So that's would be very similar to having a gauge pressure. The plunger lift can be modeled in 2 different ways. Way number 1 is to assume that you have a liquid level there, so you can use a very similar approach to rod pump. Or the second approach would be to model it as if the plunger lift was not installed. So there you use average rates from the production history to do the bottom pressure calculation. The next topic that I'll just show real quick is a new feature that came out earlier this year that has become extremely popular since we released it. It's kind of one of these features that you release it and people start to apply it everywhere. So that has been very fun. And what that feature does, I'll just show an example of it here. And hopefully you guys can see the GIF in this example. We calculated the bottom of pressures, and up to the right here there is something called estimate initial reservoir pressure, and you have to just pick what correlation you'd like to use for it. an IPR type, and you're basically just lasso fitting a set of data to estimate what your initial reservoir pressure is, which is around 500 and no 5,200, and you can also change how many data points you like to look at, etc. This is another example, just a static example of the same things. You're basically using kind of IPRs, but just in a little bit of a backwards manner. It probably works the best if you have hourly flowback data, a little bit more resolution here. And this is a good example. We have 5 days, but you have 5 times 24 data points, so you'll have 120 data points here, which is good for this particular exercise. So that's just something we wanted to show you. Maybe Mo will show an example of this. If you haven't seen this before, there is a case study here linked that you can look at. It was presented at the last knowledge sharing session, which was 2-3 weeks ago. So I recommend you to take a look at that. And the beauty of this is that it's repeatable, right? You can go and do it on every single well. So it has that pro that it's systematic and repetitive, and you don't have to do any additional data gathering. You're using bottom hole pressure calculations and the rates that you have available all over it. Then the second thing I wanted to just touch quickly about is the bottom hole pressure smoothing. So in the software, you'll see that there is an option called custom bottom hole pressure. Mo will show it later. This is a GIF showing that feature. After you've calculated your data, you click custom bottom hole pressure, and you can go in and auto fit that particular set of data. You decide what your sampling frequency is. You can change that if you like to, and you could also add data points in between it, etc. So a very powerful feature, and there's reasons to why you would like to smooth your data. Okay, and this is an important part, a practical important part of the course today, because I realized that some and that was the same thing for me a few years ago. I had probably never seen a real gauge pressure measurement for a well over time. And it's important for me to emphasize that gauge pressures, they are smooth, at least if you compare to the calculated equivalents, okay? And just to give you an example of this, and these are not extreme examples, these are very, very, very simple examples. You have the gauge pressures, and you have the equivalent calculated pressures to the right. Here's another example and the calculated equivalent. Of course, it's a gauge. You can have some of the spikes here that you would like to, at least this one, you probably would like to remove. But on a relative basis, the gauge pressures, they're way more smoothly varying than the bottom hole pressure calculated equivalent. And typically that's because, like, for instance, water is an important input to the bottom hole pressure calculation, but water is not just, unfortunately, something we measure as accurately as, for instance, oil and gas. But it can also be other things, such as bad pressure readings, etc. A couple of other examples here: gauge pressures, calculated equivalent to the right, way smoother than the gauge pressures. And also here you see an example. But of course it's a gauge, so a gauge can go down and not record anything for a few days, so of course you need to ignore that data. Smoothing there is still important, but my main point is, like, it's not only for numerical stability and for your results to look good that you smooth your bottom hole pressure calculations. It's actually a reason for it, and that's because in nature these pressures are way smoother than actually what your calculations will be, at least off the bat. So these are just some examples for you. Right. Before we're going to take a break,
yes, there's a quick question here from the audience.
Yeah.
About the application of the IPR in unconventionals when you're dealing with transient IPRs.
Yeah, and what was the question about it?
Just if you could just touch up on that for the application that we're doing for basically estimating the initial reservoir pressure.
Yeah, so in that case, you're kind of assuming that you're dealing with a short period of time, like 5 days, etc. So you're kind of assuming that the initial reservoir pressure in the fit exercise is equal to the average pressure in that period. I think Graham and stuff for, like, the nodal, forecasting the IPRs, forecasting the reservoir pressure over time, how it changes. That's more of an exercise we want to capture there. But the assumption is, like, you simplify it. You use just a few days of data. And you assume that the reservoir pressure in that part of time is approximately constant. That's what you're doing.
And I think you'll see it if you, by default, when you open the dialog in Whitson Plus, you'll see that it selects a few days. I think it's 5 or 10 days. And if you try to add, like if you made it 15, 20, 30 days, you'll start seeing that the data stops making much sense. you'll see that it will not be a given trend. So in general, if you have hourly data, then within the first 5 days, you should be able to do this exercise quite okay. Like Matthias showed, if you have daily data, then you might need, up to 10 days, I would say, just as a general rule.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like if you had a lot of data, you'd see that it would have been possible to make sense in terms of the fits, because the data starts to go much more down than the IPR itself. But luckily for that exercise, I don't think it's needed. Good. The BHP tuning is the last part before the break, which is just a way for you, if you have gauge pressures, you can actually go in and tune some of the correlations. You can tune the liquid hold-up correction factor and the friction factor at the same time. When you do that, just remember, just for the same reasons as you can't calculate bottom-hole pressures with the correlations when you have the ESP, you need to convert from the PIP pressure down. You can't do tuning of the correlations when you have a ESP. Okay, is that clear for everyone? Because there is an additional delta P across the pump here that you're not modeling. So you can only do the tuning of the correlations if you have a gauge, not an ESP. And that's also why, if you try to compare how the correlation is doing versus an ESP pressure, will never work, because you're just calculating a part of the pressure drop, while this additional delta P across the pump, you're not able to model. So that was just a little warning. There was a few references here. This is just for reference that you can look at if you'd like to learn more. It's our manual that's ever evolving, and it's also the wiki right there. I think we take a 15 minute break, Mo, and then we start the exercises.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, so we'll be back at 9:15 Houston time, and then after that we should be in good shape.
Just for everyone, please make sure you're able to log in. I'll share the login information here again, so you can access the software for the exercises. Thank you.
Make sure that you're using this field right here. And there should be a name for you here. If you're not able to log in and accessing your project, let us know, and we'll help you now in the break, the next 14 minutes.
All right. Matthias, we're ready to start.
Just remember, Mo, if the zooming part that we just go through the zooming of the browser. Just saw a couple of people sending me some screenshots about that.
I'll check that. Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Mohammed, but everyone calls me Mo. I'm going to be going through the exercise part here for this course. And I'm based out of Norway, actually, just as an FYI. So in Europe time zone right now. During the exercise, we'll try to make it like very practical. I know some of you here in the call have been doing this a lot of times, so it will seem like some of the parts are very trivial and very simple for you. But we need to just make sure that we go through them just to make sure that everyone understands the mechanics of how to do certain things in the software. We'll try to cover most of the things that people do on a daily basis when it comes to BHP. So we'll go through a well that is on gas lift, and we'll cover the different configurations of gas lift, pour buoy, valves, and the automatic setting that Matthias talked about. We'll also go through the BHP smoothing. We'll talk about the BHP calculation settings that we have implemented. We'll also go through a well with rod pump, and also a well on ESP. And finally, we'll look at a dry gas well, just to look at specifically liquid loading diagnostics, so that we are all aware of how to see the liquid loading diagnostics, because that's used to be in the comparison plots. You still can do it in the comparison plot, but now we have it also integrated into the BHP feature. After that, after kind of covering the key features and the key functionality of the software, we're going to also cover a small exercise on BHP tuning. That's what Matthias was talking about when he was talking about the paper, basically being able to tune your correlations to measured gauge pressures. And finally, we'll just cover very quickly about how to do BHP calculations and upload the data for BHP calculation using the mass upload sheet. So as Matthias covered before, everyone should have access to Whitson Plus through courses.whitson.com. Don't use your own company domain, whatever company you work for, forget about that domain for now for the course. Just go directly to courses.whitson.com. The link is in the chat in Teams. and the username there will be your email, and the password will be Whitson BHP 2024, as it's shown here and also provided in the chat. If you have any issues, just type it in the chat if that's easier, or send an email to support@whitson.com with any comments about login or anything that you're seeing that's not working out for you. I'll just show here very quickly how that will look like if you log into courses.whitson.com. So if I just log out here, okay, so you'll go courses.whitson.com, and once you do that, then you'll have basically your username is your email, your work email, and the password is the password that's provided here on the screen, Whitson BHP 2024. In this case, we'll just log on with my Office 365. That's only for me. You, in your own domain, you'll have your own Office 365 stuff as well. That's the first thing. And once you log into the software, I have a lot of projects, a lot of fields here, but you should see only one field that's called BHP Course 2024. And within that field, you should also only see one project, and that project should be the project with and it should be owned by you. You should be the owner of that project. And that's what everyone should see. In terms of how the screen looks like, you should make sure that you have your zoom in your browser is adjusted so that you can see appropriately in the software. And that's basically for most of the monitors, it should be around between 80 and 75%. If you have a smaller monitor, like if you're working out of the laptop monitor that you have, it will be even smaller. One quick way to see that your zoom is correct is if you enter your project. For example, here I'm going to enter my own project. If your zoom is too zoomed in, you'll see these buttons here. They'll split into two lines, and that's not something you want to see. So if you're seeing these buttons split into two lines like that, you can make sure to zoom out. Ideally, they should be on one line, and normally, as I said, 80% zoom should be the appropriate zoom for you. Okay, so everyone should be in a project that has your email address, and within that project you'll see 5 wells that are the wells that we will be working on. A couple of seconds here for you guys to confirm that you're able to see your own project, and when you enter the project with your email address, you see the 5 wells loaded there. If not, just type in the chat and we'll assist you with that. If you see any issues there, Matthias. Perfect. Looks good. Awesome. So we'll get started now with the exercises. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the well on gas lift, and we're going to go into the software. As I said, you will be in the BHP course field on your project, and then you go to the first well on the list. It's called the gas lift well. Then you're going to see that it will take you immediately to the scenarios view of the well, where you're going to be able to see basically the main well information, the main reservoir properties, the different attributes that correspond to this well, and you'll also be able to see which data has been added and which analysis or scenarios have been performed basically in the software. Okay, so from there now, the only thing that we care about in this course will be BHP, but for calculating BHPs, we need production data. So we can access production data by going into in the left navigation panel here. We can go into the production data tab, like you see here, or you could also click on well data added here on the production data. Either of those two will take you to the production data. And here from the production data, we can see that this well has produced for a couple of months now. And in the chart, one important thing just to kind of manipulate charts in Whitson Plus or plots in Whitson Plus is that if you're looking at the legend, you can basically click on the legend of any item to add or remove that series, to toggle on or off that series from the legend. And if you double click on a given series, if I just double click on the gas lift, it will isolate that legend, that series on the plot. Okay, so for example, I want to see only gas lift. I double click on that, then it will only the gas lift. So I can see, okay, gas lift here came in at about 30 days after a month or so. And here, those are the gas lift rates that I'm working with. So this all been pre-populated for us in the software. So we should be in good shape there. So now we're going to go from the production data editor, we're going to go directly into the bottom hole pressures. You go bottom hole pressure here on the left navigation panel, and just make sure that you're in the right well. Should be called the gas lift well here at the top. And here we're going to start inputting some data for doing the bottom hole pressure calculation. As part of the example for the course, I'm going to show specifically how you're going to input the data manually for this one case, but later we're not going to do that anymore. It's just one example that we're going to go through about how to input the data manually, okay? So we're gonna go and edit the well data here by clicking on this kind of pen button for editing the well data. And that will give us this view where we'll input the top perforation, bottom perforation MD, the deviation survey, and the well data. And that information we have in the slides here. I'm going to just put that on the screen here so we can input that. We'll start with the deviation survey. It's a very simplified deviation survey just to make sure that we all can do it in an easy way. So we start with 150 for the first row there. So it's 150 and then 150. And then the second row will be 7600 and 7515. And then if you want to add more rows, you just have to click enter to press enter on the last row, and it will just add more rows. So here, when you have an actual deviation survey yourself that you're getting from a well, you can copy paste that here and the table will expand automatically for you. So that's not an issue. There is no limit on the number of points you can have in the deviation survey. But this is just starts with 3 points just for visualization purpose. So the last point will be 18,600 for the measured depth and 7,600 for the TVD. And once we've inputted this here, I hope the zoom on my screen is okay, Matthias, so you can see like the digits. I could maybe zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, I see it, but I have a pretty big screen, so people are struggling to see it. Let us know in the chat, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let us know. Perfect. Okay, once you've input the deviation survey values here, then you can also just have a look at what the deviation survey is, just like by clicking on this button here, right next to the deviation survey title, view plot of well deviation survey. You'll just see the well deviation survey. This is good to see that you haven't made a mistake or you copied the wrong value into the deviation survey. That's fairly simple. And then we're gonna, once we've done that, we're gonna now add the top perforation and the bottom perforation MD. So it's 7,600 and 18,400 here. 7,600 and 18,400. And you see here, it also shows you what the corresponding TVD is for those depths, for those MDs, just to make sure that you can see this and that you're not inputting anything wrong on the perforations. We input 7,600 and 18,400 for the perforation MDs, top and bottom. And now we're done with this first step, basically, of the well deviation survey, of the well data, which is the well deviation survey. The second step, the second piece of data that we will need to do BHP calculations is going to be the actual well data, like the wellbore configuration data, okay? So that's what we're looking at here. And what you see here right now is just the default that gets populated in Whitson Plus whenever you create any well. So if I create a well from scratch, I just provide a name, then the well will come with these values by default. And we're going to go ahead and modify these values. Just want to show you here, as I said, the objective of this exercise is to show you how you manually can do this, how you can manually manipulate these data if you need to do it. Okay, so we're going to start by basically entering the casing data. For that, first we have to add one casing string. We have two casings. We have only one casing string to start with, and we need to add another one basically here. Okay, so the first casing string, I can look at my data set. It starts at 0 and goes down to 7549, and it's a 5.5 inch casing basically. So I go down to 7549. And the diameter here is correct, the same diameter that I have. And then the second casing string goes from the top down to 18,598, and it's a 5-inch casing here. So I can enter the value for the casing ID directly here. I could just find, okay, I know the ID for a 5-inch casing is going to be 4.2. I can just look it up in the casing catalog. So I click on this here, this button here, then it will take me to the casing catalog, and there I can just look at the different casings that are 5-inch and pick the one that corresponds to my casing. In this case, we want to pick this one, which is the one with the 18 weight. Okay, so it will populate the ID there for me, 4.276. You can input it, as I said, you can input it manually, the ID if you have the values, or you can look it up in the catalog, right? So that's the casing part. And now we can go over to the tubing part. So we'll have a tubing installed. The tubing depth will be 7325. And we see that the tubing is 2 3/8 tubing. So we can go ahead and do that. 7325. Right now, by default, it's a 2 7/8. So I need to modify that. As I said, I can go and change these numbers manually or use the casing catalog. here and look for basically the 2 3/8 tubing. And in this case, I'm looking at this one here, 4.6 weight. That's the one I want to input. Okay, so I'll end up with 1.995 ID and 2.375 OD. And the roughness gets populated here by default. So now I'm done with adding the casing. I've added the tubing. So now the software should know how the well is set up for the bottom hole pressure calculation. And then I can tell it more details about how to do the calculation. Okay, and that's the information that's down here. So we need to specify a flow path. As Matthias said, if you specify unknown, it will determine which is your flow path based on the casing and tubing pressures automatically. In this case, we're going to switch the flow path to tubing because we want to use the artificial lift. So first thing you're going to do is switch your flow path to tubing. Here we go. We'll switch the flow path to tubing, and then the artificial lift method here, we're going to pick gas lift. And you see, once you pick gas lift, if you go back to none, if you pick gas lift, you'll see that a new dropdown will show up, and that's going to ask you for what's your gas lift configuration that you want to work with. Do you want to work with a pour buoy configuration? Do you want to provide the valve depths, or do you want to work with automatic or a reversed valve setup? So in this case, we want to try to do the calculation with a pour buoy, and we'll hit save. And now we've input all the data that we need for the bottom hole pressure calculation. So remember, we input top perforation, bottom perforation, we input the deviation survey, and we input casing and tubing data, and we told the software now how we wanted to calculate the bottom hole pressures. So it's a pour buoy gas lift configuration, and we can just click on this button to calculate bottom hole pressures here. And there we have it. We get basically the bottom hole pressures calculated for each of the production data points that we have in time. In this case, we're looking at the well that has daily production data, but if you had hourly or 15-minute data, it all would be the same. You just input it, and then the software will calculate the bottom hole pressure for each individual point. One thing that a lot of people think that can be confusing sometimes is the way this is plotted. So the way we plot this, as Matthias talked about in the theory part, is that we like to show you, as an engineer who's working with this, I'll just remove this. As an engineer who's working with this, we like to show you what is the difference between all the different correlations. I remember from before, when I used to work with calculating bottom hole pressures, I had to specify which correlation I want to do it with. And it was not clear to me if there was any difference if I picked a different correlation. In Whitson Plus, we like to always give you that clear picture that there is a difference between the correlations and what that difference is. In some cases, it will be small. In some cases, it will be larger. And as Matthias pointed out, very often in the early times, specifically when you have a single phase flow, then all the correlations will fall on top of each other, and then they will start to diverge once you start getting multi-phase flow in the well. Okay, so here you always get the possibility, you always get all the correlations, the 4 of them. You can toggle on or off, as I said, by clicking on the legend, and then you can pick here at the top, you see what it says here, bottom hole pressure to be used in calculations. And that means this bottom hole pressure that you're going to pick here is going to determine which of the outputs of the correlations you're going to be using in calculations throughout the software. So when you do a flowing material balance, when you do any type of RTA analysis, when you're running your numerical model, which of these correlations you want to use, then you make that decision. It's kind of, we like to call it like an informed decision, because now you know, let's say you picked Beggs and Brill. Now you know that Beggs and Brill would be the highest of the correlations, the one giving you the highest sand phase or bottom hole pressure. So that's important. That's an important thing to know as an engineer working with this. Very good. Are there any questions on this? Hopefully.
There's one struggling with a savior, but I'll follow up with her directly.
Could be a refresh. Just have to. That's one thing to remind everyone, because Whitson Plus is a web-based software, so we're doing everything over the web. So whenever we click on launching a calculation here, basically a request for calculating is going to servers in the cloud, and the cloud is calculating and then returning back. And because it's web-based, as any web-based thing, it can have some issues in the web browser. And your best friend in that case is this reload button. You can reload the page, or the shortcut for doing that is Control-R. So if you do Control-R from anywhere you are, it will basically refresh the view of the page. Generally, if there's an update of the software, it will fetch the latest update of the software, and that will be very helpful. So if you have any problems, number one thing we ask you to do is just try refreshing, see if that solves it. If not, then we'll jump in and assist you. All right. So now this is the first part of the exercise. We wanted to talk about
Mo, just real quick here. Justin has a question about what is what is the recommend, or what's like a good error percentage versus measured gauge pressure. And if you can't get close enough with the base correlations, you need to do tuning. So it will be kind of an error range there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I honestly didn't have an answer to this. I still don't have a good answer to this, but from the paper, I think I would say that if you're within 5%, then you should be happy. If you're within 5% of the gauge pressure, that's generally quite okay, I would say. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Matthias.
No, I think that's true. Like if you're within plus minus 5%, you're in really good shape. You'll see that a lot of the data would be within plus minus 10%. When it comes to the tuning, that's also a function of if you have gauge pressures available too. So that can be a little bit just a function of that. But some between 5 to 10% kind of engineering errors is what we see a lot when we do this.
Yeah, we'll go through a tuning exercise here, so we'll see how that looks like. Some of the things that you can kind of try to identify with what you need to tune. Hopefully that will also be helpful.
And Mike is also asking about where you specify the properties for the injection gas. So the injection gas properties, like densities and stuff, if that's what he's thinking about, that will be implicitly set in the PVT. Else we'll just assume some standard gas correlation if that's not set. And the gas lift injection rate is put into the production data piece. And also, I'll check yours, Aaron, there real quick.
Yeah, that's also one thing that we've added recently to the software is that some people, when they were looking at this plot, they're wondering, okay, kind of they would like to see their production data kind of laid out on top of this, or at least synced in the same x-axis. And so we've added this button here that says show rates and surface pressures. And if you click on that, it will basically show your rates. And that could be a helpful thing just to see kind of how your bottom hole pressure correlations that are now grayed out in the background correlate with your rates. Right. So that's kind of the basic configuration of a gas lift well. If you don't have any information about the gas lift, then you just go and do a pour bore. You're injecting, basically, you're assuming that there's no packer at the end of the tubing, and that you're able to inject through the annuals into the tubing that way. What we can do now is go to the next kind of a little bit more advanced setup on gas lift wells, and that's basically if we had valves in our tubing. And the way to do that is fairly simple. In the software, in the gas lift configuration, instead of selecting pour buoy like we did here on the well data, selected pour buoy in the gas lift configuration. Instead of doing that, you just valves, and there we're going to input. It's going to pop up basically this dialog that asks you for valve. And for the first part of this exercise, we're going to just input a valve depth. We're going to say that, okay, that this well has a gas lift valve at 7,000, and we hit save. We see that the bottom of the tubing is at 7,300, so it's almost at the bottom of the tubing, just 300 feet away. And then we save again, and then we just calculate bottom hole pressure. So one very important thing about the software, before we click calculate, once you've made that change, now you went here, you went to the second step, well data, and you just changed the configuration from pour buoy to valves. The software should be able to identify that something has changed. And it will tell you that with this yellow warning that's here. So it's telling you here that, okay, that inputs that you have, they have changed since your previous simulation. And what that means is that the values that you're seeing here, they do not correspond to the inputs. So you need to rerun for the outputs of the calculation to be consistent with what you input. That's basically because in this case, we've changed the gas lift configuration from pour buoy to valves, and therefore we have to just calculate again. Okay, once I calculate, then it says same values as used for previous simulation, because now we're in good shape. Okay, so that's if you wanted to run it with valves. As I said, you go to well data, you switch to valves, and it will ask you for the valve inputs. That's if you have one valve, but as Matthias talked about many times, we have something like this. Okay, you'll have gas lift tally gas lift installation sheet, where you have multiple valves in your wellbore, and you have the corresponding opening and closing pressure for each of those valves. That's something that very early on, some of our customers requested that, they wanted the capability of inputting all the valves and that the software automatically was able to determine which valve would be open at a given point in time. And that's something that we implemented, and you can add those. And I'm going to show you now how you can do that. Okay. We'll go to the next step, which is the valves. As we talked about, as Matthias showed you in the theory, when you specify multiple valves versus depth or in the wellbore, basically we'll look at the PSC and PSO for the valves, and we'll find which one is open at a given point in time based on the casing pressure, and the gas lift will be injected the first valve that's open from the top to the bottom. So in this case, we want to add 3 valves as shown in the screenshot here. And we're going to go ahead and do that by going into Whitson Plus. For those of you who've not followed so far, you just open this well data card, go to number 2 well data, and in the valve configuration, you click Edit Valve Data. See there? Edit Valve Data. And here it says joints on the top right, and you can click the plus button to add more valves. And in this case, we just want 3. If you wanted more, you can have as many as you want, and you can just copy paste it directly from the gas lift installation sheet. Just notice this: if I switch to 1 valve, I only get asked for the valve depth, for the MD of the valve. But if I switch to more than 1 valve, then now suddenly it's a table, because if I have more than 1 valve, the software needs to know the PSO and the PSC, the pressure surface open and pressure surface close, for each of the valves, so the software can determine based on the pressures at each point in time, where are we injecting, okay? So we're gonna just input some data here for that. You could, if you have that data in your gas lift tally sheet, you just copy paste it, but this we'll do it very quickly here. We'll just add 1 at 3,000 with 1,142. You just do that here, 3,000, and then 942. So these are the values for the first valve. The second valve is going to be 5,854 and 834. And the third valve is still at 7,000, but with a PSO of 782 and 762. I'll leave this on the screen here now for for half a minute here, just so you guys can copy it or enter the same data.
Perfect. Just dealing with a couple of questions we got in there, Mo, just while we wait. Could be a natural place. So our friend Mike, he was wondering about GAPL and Pagel applications. So if you have plungers, so if you have a combination, I sent you a little link there, Mike, that kind of goes through how we're dealing with that in the software, just in the manual, talking about those two items. But it will basically be when we went through the gap, or when we went through the plunger lift, there was 2 ways of dealing with that: liquid levels, and another way where we're just averaging the rates. So if you're dealing with either GAPL or Pagel, it will basically be the second option of those 2 that you're using together with, for instance, if you have gas lift there, you'll have to specify the valves, etc. So it's an own section there, I think, that talks about that piece. Awesome. The Jackie also asked about how do we handle the calculation if there's packers in the configuration. I don't really know. That's primarily relevant for the quiet side thing, right? Mo, if you need to just know if there's packers there or not. But
yeah, that's a good question, I think, Jackie. So basically, if you specify, then it basically will be such that it's assuming basically that you have packers in your configuration. You can kind of bypass that if you want to say that there's no packers by saying that the last valve is open and adding a valve at the end of the tubing here, like an artificial valve. But basically, if you have packers, then the only way to inject gas into the tubing will be through valves, and then once you specify the valves, that's basically automatically taken care of. Hopefully that's what you meant.
Yeah. Good.
And yeah, and also as Matthias said, like if you're doing the calculation on the quiet side and you have packer and you don't have gas lift, so there's no communication between the annulus and the tubing, then then it doesn't make any sense to do the calculation on the quiet side, because there's no use of that, at least since you want to have communication to the flow inside for it to be useful for any type of engineering calculation, for doing RTA or anything like that. Okay, so hopefully that was enough time for people to look at the values that we've input here. Basically 3 valve depths, we have 3 valves, and we have the opening and closing pressures for each of the valves. You click save, and then you click save again on the wellbore configuration. And same here, it tells you that the gas lift data has changed. You click calculate bottom hole pressures, and it will recalculate the bottom hole pressures now with the valves. Now, one thing that many people wonder about is, once you've inputted the valves, since the software is hopefully clever enough to capture that there is multiple valves in the wellbore configuration, and that it has to inject at different depths depending on the opening, on the pressures and the casing pressures. The question that came up was, how do you know, or where do you see which valve is open at a given point in time, or where are we injecting through at a given point in time? And that's something that has come so often that we've basically decided to add it here just as an FYI. This is a future development. It's coming hopefully soon. We have a release in June, and I'm hoping it will be there. But it will be another tab here that will be basically activated anytime you have a gas lift configuration that will allow you to look at the valve depth. In the meantime, you can still do it, but it's not directly here, but you can do it in the comparison plot. And I'm going to show you how to do that. If you go into the comparison plot, by default, it's going to be on the template called default, and that we want to just switch that template from default, a template that my colleague Graham has created that's called gas lift depth lookback. If you don't find it, just type it, that gas, and you should find that template and just click on that. And then on the left, you'll have a list of wells, and you'll select the gas lift well for that. And you should see something like this. What this is showing, I can't take credit for making the visuals here, but what this is showing is what the gas lift valve depth is in green versus time. So you can see that we go from injecting at 3,000 feet, go up to 7,000 feet, then down to 5,000. Most of the time we're injecting right in the middle, but sometimes we're injecting at the top, sometimes we're injecting at the bottom. And this is all based on basically the casing pressures and the configuration that we've input. For your own configuration, it of course will look different depending on your case. But this is just an example of some useful information that people have asked for. We will basically, as I said, integrate this plot that is now part of the comparison plot. We'll integrate it into the bottom hole pressure view so that you'll have it here as a tab that you can click if you have a configuration that has gas lift and this is relevant for you. Okay, I will repeat very quickly. If you want to see the gas lift valve depth versus time, you can go to the comparison plot. You'll find a template that's called gas lift depth lookback from Helfrich at Whitson.com. And if you click on that template and select the correct well, that it should be the gas lift well, then you should see the data plotted like this. The other stuff, the gas, you also see the gas lift, gas rate, etc. But the most important thing that we're looking for is the depth, the gas lift valve depth, where we're injecting at a given point in time. Okay, so now that we've covered those items, we can go back to the bottom hole pressure and make sure you're in the right well, just on the well that's called gas lift well here at the top. You can check the well name. And now we're going to go through another configuration of gas lift, the so-called automatic configuration. This is something that Matthias covered, but I'll just touch upon it here very quickly. When we use the automatic configuration, what we're doing is that we're basically calculating a gradient in the flowing and in the injection side, and we're finding the point at which those two gradients intersect. The point at which those two gradients intersect will be tagged as the injection depth, and will be the point at which we will adjust the rates so that the gas lift rate becomes part of the flowing wells. Okay. And that applies whether you're doing tubing flow or annulus flow. It's just that it's reversed in either case. But basically, it's finding the intersection between the two, which physically would make sense. You just need to make sure that your data is correct. So if you want to do that in the software, you just change the gas lift configuration from valves that we were in to automatic, and then you click save, and then you calculate the bottom hole pressures, and you'll see almost all of these cases are giving us practically the same output. Like in terms of the bottom hole pressure, we're not seeing large differences there. And that's okay, because basically we're just calculating bottom hole pressures for a gas lifted well with different sets of data and with different configurations. So we're not expecting big differences here. The one thing that will be different here in this case, because we're using the automatic configuration, what do you think is going to be different? There's one thing that we're really looking for when we're doing the automatic configuration, or that would be very interesting to look at, and that's the gas lift valve depth, okay? So if I go back to the comparison plot now here, you see in my previous plot, I can maybe pull that up in the presentation here real quick. Let me see. In my previous plot, you see it was kind of discrete because I had specified the depths at which I could inject. I said that it could inject at 3,000, at 5,000, or at 7,000. So the points here, the green points, were discrete. I was either injecting at 3, 5, or 7. While now, because I picked automatic, at each point in time, the software is finding the intersection between the flowing gradient and the injection gradient in the wellbore, and it's giving me that depth that it's finding. And you see that the depth is not discrete anymore, not like 2 or 3 specific values or the set of valves that I have, but it could be anything. And basically, if it doesn't find an intersection between the two, it injects at the end of the tubing. That's also like a fail-safe that we have there on the automatic bottom pressure calculation. Any questions, Matthias?
No. We're still showing inputs have changed. Okay, I'm going to follow up with Jeff's there, but no real questions. These are just small things here and there.
Yep. Let me know if I need to show something on the screen for everyone. And then the final thing that we're going to cover as part of this gas lift well, we're going to move on. So for those who don't work with gas lift, sorry, we're moving on soon. It's this is the last part that we're going to be talking about gas lift basically, and that's this quiet side calculation. Some people call it the silent side bottom hole pressure calculation. And Matthias touched upon it. I just want to do a quick refresher here. What we're basically doing is that we're splitting the calculation into 2 phases. Basically, we're doing one from the wellhead pressure down to the injection point, to the gas lift injection point, where we know the injection side should be single phase gas. So there on that side, hopefully we're sure that the injection side is single phase gas down to the injection. And so we can do a bottom hole pressure calculation using single phase flow on that side. And then from that point, from the injection valve down to the top perforation, the calculation is done just as usual with multi-phase flow. So you're basically kind of splitting it in 2, but doing a large part of your calculation on single phase flow, which is much easier and much more accurate, should be in general. So that's what we're going to try to do here. And the way we will do that in the software is that we're going to go into the well data again, and you can see that our flow path is tubing, the lift method is the gas lift, and the configuration for gas lift is still the automatic one. That's all good. On compute through, we have flow inside. That was set up for all the calculations that we've done so far, and you can change that to static, okay? And once you do that, you get an additional option. If you're calculating through the static side, then you can select down to which point do you want to do the static calculation, okay? And this goes back to this figure here. If you have a gas lift assisted well, a gas lift well, sorry, then I'd recommend you to do it down to the gas lift injection point, because that's where you're sure that it's single phase. You know, hopefully it's only gas there, unless there's a big surprise, but should be only gas there down to the injection point. So doing the quiet side calculation down to the gas lift valve makes sense. So we switch the compute through option to static on the quiet side, and then the compute static down to, we just set it to gas lift valve. And then we save, and then we again calculate bottom hole pressure. And now you'll see something curious about this, at least, that the bottom hole pressure calculation, if you calculate, you'll see that your bottom hole pressure calculations will not look like we've been seeing before. You know, it's a little bit different than what we were seeing, or quite a bit different than what we've been seeing before. At least in these first, let's see, we can switch from dates to days. These first 30 days. Why do you think this is happening? Anyone has wants to take a guess of what's going on here? Remember, we've switched the calculation now to happen on the quiet side, and something is happening in the first 30 days that's making my calculation it's not correct. At least it doesn't look correct. Like, you know, the bottom hole pressure estimated is around 200 psi. Any guesses on the chat? Yeah, perfect. No gas injection. Very good. Good, Jeff and Aaron. basically we're not injecting there, and you could verify that by clicking on this icon, show rates and surface pressures, and adjust this axis here. So you'll see here, if I just remove everything and just keep the gas lift right here, you'll see that we started injecting at this time here, and that's exactly the time at which the static calculation starts to work out. So my guess, this is a real well. My guess is that this well had a packer installed before, or there was no communication between the annulus and the tubing before a gas lift started, and therefore those casing pressures that we have before gas lift started are not meaningful for doing static calculation. That's very important. It's very important to know, like, when you're doing a calculation, what the assumptions of that calculation are. And in this case, if you want to do the static calculation, you should make sure that there is communication between the annulus and the flowing side, or the flowing side and the non-flowing side. So the next thing I want to show you here is what we call custom PWF, or PWF smoothing, or custom BHP slash BHP smoothing. For that, we can go back in the configuration. We can go back to the flowing side. We don't need the quiet side anymore. It was just and then we calculate bottom hole pressures. We get our bottom hole pressures back to what they were. And then we're going to go basically and open the selection here. When you're selecting which correlation you want to use, you can select custom PWF. Instead of selecting any of the correlations, you're going to say, okay, I want a custom PWF. And what that means is that you're going to create kind of your own bottom hole pressure profile. You can select which bottom hole pressure to use as the basis for creating your own bottom hole pressure profile. Let's say in this case, I wanted to go for Haggerty and Brown. And the main use of this feature is that many times you have these scatter in the data in the bottom hole pressure calculation, and as Matthias showed, the reality is if you had a gauge there wouldn't be as much scatter. Most of the scatter here comes basically from the rates that are some measurement issues with the rates that you basically make it so that each of these calculations are very sensitive to those rates. And what this allows you to do, if I click on the auto fit button here, it will just basically draw a curve throughout the bottom hole pressure profile, the calculated bottom hole pressure profile, and I can basically adjust that curve at my pleasure. In this case, the sampling frequency was set to 20. That's a default. This well doesn't have much production data, so 20 is too much. I would reduce it down to 5, maybe even 2. You could do that, then auto fit. You'll see that looks good, and you can drag some points around if you don't like the shape. Suddenly, okay, maybe you want to make this lower, you can take it down, you can move like this, and basically make the shape that you think is appropriate. But as a base case, it allows you to kind of smooth that main profile. And if I click save here now, you'll see that now as part of what's selected for my calculations is going to be this custom PWF. And if I just keep that series isolated here and compare it to the Haggerty and Brown itself, you see how much smoother that custom PWF that I just created looks like. That will be very helpful for any type of RTA analysis for running the numerical models as well. So that's something that's very good. We'll also talk about how to smooth the source of these pressures, which are the rates or the wellhead pressures. That's something that we can also do, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the course. I think that's what I wanted to cover on the gas lift. I think we could take a quick break now, and then we can come back to the rod pump calculations and the rest of the exercises. That's okay. Is there any questions, Matthias, or pending items there?
Nope, nothing. So we'll be back 10:20, you said, Mo?
Yeah, in 10 minutes would be good. Just I don't know what time would that be. 10 minutes. 10-minute break. Great.
Thanks, Mo.
Welcome back, everyone. So we'll continue.
That was a good question that we can address in the chat just before we get started. And that was a great question from Kenny. I'm assured if I missed this, but on this screen, so it's talking about the valves for the gas lift. If you have the last valve always open box checked, in this case, is that saying that once the pressure is less than the PSC of 834 psi, the achieved force, or I guess to achieve this forces the model to assume injection gas is always at 700 feet or valve 3.
I see. I think I understand. Yeah, very good question there. Basically, if you tick it as always open, that will mean that the software will sort of ignore these PSO and PSC here. So if your pressure, if your casing pressure or your injection pressure is lower than this PSC, then it will still inject through this point, if that's thick. If it's not thick, though, then it will not inject at any place. It will just, all of them will be closed. And that's because, basically, you wouldn't have met the condition for any of the valves to be open. That's why this thick box is here. If in your gas lift tally you have an orifice at the bottom in the last valve, then that's why you should take this. Does that make sense, Kenny?
Yes, it does. Thank you. So it is like an orifice, and in this case, if that's checked, if you're assuming that it's like an orifice, so once your valve 2 in this case, that pressure, that valve closes, you're basically injecting at 7,000 feet as long as you're below 834. Even if you're 634, I mean, it's still going to be at 7,000 feet. But if you don't have it checked, it could go all the way to around end of tubing. Once that valve 3 closes, it should be around end of tubing.
Yeah, I think the way we have it set up in the software is that if it's not checked, then it's not injected. If it doesn't meet any of these criteria, if none of them are open. So it doesn't go, I don't think it goes to the end of the tubing, but that probably would be a good idea. I think there would probably have to have like another option if there's a packer or not. But yeah, that's a good point. I'm pretty sure what we do is that we don't inject if this is not provided. Does that make sense, Kenny? Like, do you understand what I'm trying to explain? That if you didn't take this and you don't meet any of the criteria, so basically if your PSC is lower than 762, then the well will not inject any gas.
Gotcha.
At that point in time. But I see your point that, maybe what we should have is that you inject at the end of tubing in that scenario. That could be, I don't know if that's that would be preferred probably. And that would make sense to me.
Yeah, that would be, I think, helpful just to know if it's like an orifice. You would have an orifice if you have a packer in the well. If you don't have a packer in the well, that last valve should have a closing pressure, and basically your orifice at that point is your end of tubing. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Matthias, if you can note that down, go ahead.
You can possibly add that as an additional valve, like whatever your end of tubing depth is, you can add that as an additional valve and have that as always open, so that in the case that the pressure doesn't match any of the closing pressures, then it'll automatically inject end of tubing. What do you think?
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that would take care of that at least. But I still think that it would be good to add it. We'll discuss that to add if you basically don't have the stick, that it goes to the end of the tubing automatically. If you just add that to the backlog, Teja or Matthias, that would be appreciated. Good, very good point, Kenny. Thanks, and good input, Teja. Get back here. Okay, so the one small thing I wanted to show you all here was basically these calculation settings, BHP calculation settings, and those were implemented at the request of Diamondback and like a couple of operators that wanted to have this option. And what this means is, I'll try to exemplify it here. If I go to the wellbore configuration in this case, you can see that I've said that in this wellbore configuration has as an artificial lift method gas lift, even though I don't have gas lift in this well from day one. And in this calculation options that we have here, I have it ticked so that it computes bottom hole pressures for the gas lift when gas lift rate is 0. And that's why we're seeing the profile that we're seeing. If I unticked it here and I saved and I relaunch the calculation, then you'll see that I'll lose basically the pressures in this early time, because in this early time there was no gas lift rate. So that's and there's some other places here where maybe the gas lift rate was not recorded or it went to 0, and then the software will basically not calculate at those points. And that's an option that you can have if you are setting up your wellbore configuration such that you start with a wellbore configuration that doesn't have artificial lift, and then you add a second one at a given point in time and add the artificial lift, the gas lift on that one, then this option being ticked off might be helpful for you. But in general, for gas lift, we like to keep it activated. And in the next exercise, we'll discuss also an example with these calculation options with rod pump, where it can be a little bit more relevant if you want to do the calculation with rod pump when there's no liquid level provided. So now we'll move on to the next part of the exercise, and that's basically the BHP calculation with rod pump. And for that, we're going to go into the rod pump well in the software. Let's see here. So you can switch wells. For those of you who are not familiar with the software, you can switch wells from the top bar here. If you click on the well list here, you can select another well from the list. This list is actually, if you have a long list of wells, this is searchable. You could just search like this. Oh, just search like rod pump, then you find it, and then you type. You go to the rod pump well, or you can just select from the list. In this case, it's only 5 wells, so it should be fairly straightforward to just find the rod pump well. And here, if we open the well configuration, just make sure you've switched wells to the rod pump well first, and then you open the well data. Now you can see that the well deviation survey is all input, like the complete well deviation survey is input for us. So that's good. You can view the plot of the well deviation survey right here, just to ensure that everything is okay. There's no surprises there. And then if you go to the well data, we see that this well is basically flowing through casing, but we've called this well rod pump well. So hopefully this well eventually started flowing through rod pump. And as Matthias talked about, for doing the calculation in a rod pump well, we need to have liquid levels in the well bore in the well measured, so that we can do the calculation in the rod pump well. And I can show that here real quick, just as a reminder. So this is how we do the calculation in the rod pump. So we basically divide it into 3 segments. So we go from the top perforation to the end of tubing. That's basically just multi-phase pipe flow. From the end of tubing to the liquid level is just a stagnant column of liquid and gas. And then from the top of the liquid level to the wellhead, it's basically single phase flow in the anodes. So for that is why we need the liquid level in a well that is on rod pump. And if we wanted to look at our well, we wanted to see when does the configuration change from casing to rod pump, then we can go to the production data and we can look at the liquid level here. If you click on the edit button here, you'll be able to access basically the table of all the production data. And we can go down here. You can do control arrow down on this column, and it'll take you to the first point where you have a liquid level. This would normally be known by you, if you're working with the well, but in this case, we could just find it out. It's basically the 5th of March of 2015. That's when this well started to flow on rod pump. You can see there was a shut-in just the day before, and then it was basically switched to rod pump, and we have liquid levels recorded from that day onwards. So in the wellbore calculations, in the BHP calculation, we need to tell it that before this time, there was no rod pump, and after this time, we have a rod pump. So we need to add a new configuration, a change of configuration with time. So we're going to go through how that is done, and we know that it's the 5th of March 2015 that we had the configuration. So we go ahead and go back to the bottom hole pressure, open the well data, and on the well data card here, we have the first configuration, and we just add a new one by clicking on this plus button here. The first configuration is okay. Now we suddenly just installed rod pump, and we're going to change the use from date here. You see that for the first configuration, there's no date because that applies from the first data point of the well until you go to the second configuration, which you have to provide the use from date from, and it's going to use that date. It's going to use that configuration from that date onwards, and you can add as many configurations as you want. Okay, so here it's going to be March is correct, but this is not the 2nd, but the 5th of March that we start in rod pump. And then we can have a look here at the slide deck just to see the data that we need to input for rod pump. So the casing information, I think, is the same as we have. Let's double check. That's the same as we have. And then we go through the tubing down to 7,022 feet. So we add a tubing here. You see there's no tubing string here right now in the second configuration because it copies what was in the initial one. And in the initial one, we were just encasing. We go to the second configuration. Again, you can switch configurations either by clicking on these here, or on the left here, you can also, you have an overview and you can see, you can switch between configurations there. So we're on configuration number 2. We want to add a tubing, and the tubing is going to go down to 7,022 feet, and it's 2 7/8 tubing. Let's see here. So we can get it from the casing catalog. Let's see, that should be this one. There you go. That's the tubing we want. And on the flow path now, because we have rod pump installed, we're going to switch that to tubing. It's flowing through the tubing, and the artificial lift method is going to be rod pump. So we've added a new configuration. That's why we have two now here. And now in the new configuration, we just added a tubing string down to 7,022 feet, the diameter of the tubing string here. And then we changed the flow path from casing that it was to tubing and the artificial lift method to rod pump. Good. Then we save and we click calculate. You should see something like this on your calculated bottom hole pressures. Let me know if you don't see it or have any issues seeing this. Are we good, Matthias? Hopefully people are following. So if you look at the data here, you'll see that we said that we installed rod pump on the 5th of March. So from this point onwards, we started doing the calculation with rod pump. And there's something that looks kind of weird here on the rod pump calculation, and that's basically this kind of hump that we have here, where all the correlations are predicting a much higher pressure than they have been predicting in the previous points and after that. Anyone has any idea of what might be going on here? Like why is the calculation given such a high value? If we wanted to look at this on our end, like the first thing that would come to mind would be, let's look at the inputs. And we know that for all of these points, the inputs that we provided here, they are the same. It's the same wellbore configuration, the same deviation survey, the same artificial lift method and everything. But what's changing from one point to another is the rate. So what we could do is just take here and show the surface rates. And you can see that those points there, if you look at if I zoom in a little bit on the rates, you can see that for those points there, the gas rates are going to 0, while the oil and water rates, so it's not a shut-in, it's probably some issues with the measurement of the gas. So that's what's driving this bottom hole pressure going up in the calculation like this, right? Just a very low gas rate at that point, or not very low, non-existing gas rate at that point. And that's why this is happening, but this is not something that's real. We know that that's not real, so we can fix it. Based on what we did before, you have somewhat of an idea of how to fix it. You can do that in two ways. I'd like to show you the two ways to do it. We could fix just the output, and that means fix the bottom hole pressure. Okay, I don't like that the bottom hole pressure is so high. I'm going to fix that. I'm going to go here and change it, select the custom PWF like we did on the gas lift well. Do custom PWF, then you select the correlation that you would like to use. Let's say you want to use Hagedorn and Brown, or whatever you would like to use for this case. Let's say I want to make the sampling frequency. I'm happy with all the points, so I'll just make it 1. I just want to make sure that I could remove these points here. I can remove them. I can take them and pull them down. Then I'll be kind of drawing the shape again, or just try to auto fit again. I could also use this lasso remove point, which I personally like to use a lot. So that allows you to just kind of remove points in bulk that you can lasso around. So you can click on this and I'll lasso around these points here, and then it will just remove them. It will ignore those points in the fitting. And then it will give me now custom bottom hole pressure that's basically following along exactly the Hagedorn and Brown, except for these points that I didn't like because I saw there was an issue with the data. So that's one way to do it, to correct this in the output. I got the output, I don't like it, I want to fix it. I can also do it because I know that the gas rate there was wrong. I could also fix the input. The way to do that is in the production data. You go back to the production data, and you don't have to go and do that manually, but instead you can click on the smooth button here on the top right. So now we went to the production data, and in the smooth button here on the top right, this will allow you to basically smooth any production data for any calculation, not only for bottom hole pressure, but this will apply throughout the software to your numerical model, to your flowing material balance, RTA, everything, even for your DCA. So the first thing you have to do is select, okay, what is it that you want to smooth? In this case, we know that it's the gas rate, and we know it's, maybe I could just switch to dates, smooth here, back to gas rates. We know it's right here. We have a problem. And then what you do is you can add basically points around these. Let's see here. And I can fill that gap with those points only and save it. I can also do the same I did with the bottom hole pressures, which is to auto fit this. I'll show you that just in a second, but if I just save this here, I have to select if I want to use the smoothed data or not. So I'll just have to select here the gas rate that I want to use the smoothed data. And this is basically in case you've applied smoothing, but you actually kind of regretted, or you didn't want to use the smoothed data, you just wanted to try it out. But now I want to apply it. And you see how now suddenly this gas hump was removed, like the zero gas rate was removed, and it's all good. If you didn't want to only add the points on the gas rate, but you wanted to do like a whole autofit of all the points and kind of smooth the whole data, you can still do that. As I said, this data set has not so many points, so I usually would reduce the frequency here and then get something like this. And you can manually adjust if you would like some of the points to follow more closely to any part of the data set. And you can do the same with the lasso remove, etc., like I showed you. So now what I did 2 ways.
Well, just I think that was really good. Someone that wanted to see if you could repeat the steps just one time there.
The production data smoothing or the PWF?
The last one.
Last one. Okay. So,
yeah, production data only.
Production data smoothing. Yeah. So basically, we saw that we had a gas rate gap. Basically, that the gas rate was zero or missing for a certain period of time, and we knew that that was not correct because we saw that both oil and water were still flowing as they were before. So we want to fill that gap. So we went into the production data here. We were in the bottom hole pressure. We went into production data for the well. And then on the top right, we have an option that's called smooth. And if you click on that, then the first thing you have to do is select which production data you want to smooth. We know it's the gas rate that we want to take care of. And then we need to find like where the gap was. In this case, we remember that the gap was at this point in time. I just zoomed into that and I just added the 2 points by clicking on this add points here. Just added these 2 points to fill. Basically, this will fill this gap of 3 days with rates, basically kind of doing a linear interpolation between these 2 points that I've added. And I select that I want to use that smoothed gas rate in my calculation. And when I hit save, I've now reset the zoom just to see the whole thing again. When I click save, now this zero rates that I had here are not there anymore. And now they are replaced by this interpolation that I've added. And you can see it here that the gas rates are smoothed, basically. You can see that in the series, it's called smoothed gas rate. Does that help?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, very good. Now, if I go back, so the difference between those two, as I said, one of them that I did, the custom PWF, was adjusting the output. So my calculations were still the same. I was just saying, okay, now I drew a new pressure profile that was ignoring this part of the output. And in any analysis that I do, I'll use this new profile, which is the yellow line. See that yellow line without this hump. That's what I did first. Now what I did is I changed the original data. I smoothed the rates because I knew that the rates were a problem. And if I calculate bottom hole pressures now again, it should remove this hump because it will do it without those rates. Basically, and you see here that basically you get sort of the same output, whether you did it one way or another. Very good. Hopefully, if there's any questions, just... And now for this, we can also touch upon the BHP calculation settings that we talked about for the gas lift well. And there's an option here also for rod pump wells. So the way to access that, you open the well data card, you edit the well data. There's this little cog on the top right of that box. This is called calculation options. And I want to try what will happen if I turn off this switch where it calculates rod pump when the liquid level is 0. To do that, before I go there, I personally will do that. You guys don't have to follow. Just want to show you an example. I'll go back to the production data, and on the liquid level, I'll just remove, let's say I didn't have liquid level for some period of time. So I'll just remove a set of liquid levels here, just for the sake of the example. So suddenly I have a rod pump, but there was in the database, there was no recorded liquid level for those points in time, which is the case with some of you guys that are working with this. And if I run the calculation right now, you can see what's going to happen with the bottom hole pressures. You see how this, now I get this bump, and this period here coincides with the period where I don't have a liquid level, where I didn't provide a liquid level. So because of this, some of you have requested that basically we go and add this option where you can turn off the rod pump calculation. Basically, it will not compute a bottom hole pressure if you've said that you have a rod pump, but that you haven't provided a liquid level. For consistency, such that the pressures that you're using anywhere, they always if you have a rod pump, they're always consistent. And if you don't have the correct inputs, then it's not there, and the engineer needs to react and act on that. If I calculate now with that option ticked off, then it basically will skip that period where there is no liquid level. And this can be useful also. Let's say you're just going to go here and smooth the data, then it's much more useful if there's a gap there. Okay, I have to fill that gap with a smoothing instead of having this hump, which was totally artificial. Do we have any questions in the chat? Are we good, Matthias?
Yeah, nothing here.
Okay, guys. So then the next thing we're going to cover here, I think there was a question in the chat about that earlier today, is basically a well on ESP. Let's go through this real quick. And that you're going to do now for the well on ESP is that, as Matthias talked about, if you have an ESP, then you basically we don't calculate the pressure drop across the ESP, but instead for the ESP, you'll have, in most of the cases, in more than 90% of the cases, you should have recorded a pump intake pressure for the ESP. So you'll have the pressure that's coming into the pump here before the delta P of the pump is applied. Okay, and that pressure at the inlet of the pump, you can basically use as a gauge pressure and calculate in the software. And the software, what it will do is it will calculate from that pressure down to top perforation, so correcting that pressure within the software. So I'll show you how we'll do that on an ESP well. So we'll switch wells here again on the top menu from the rod pump well to the ESP well. And now in this case, these for ESP wells, the gauge pressure that we're inputting here, that we have now that is being shown in the screen, that should be corresponding to the pump intake pressure. If you have an ESP, then your gauge pressure that you're inputting should be your pump intake pressure for the calculation to make sense. And that's shown here. That's basically provided together with the production data, provide the gauge pressure. And that's already populated for us. And what we need to do is just open the well data. I'm going to show you how to set it up so that it calculates, assuming that there is an ESP. So we have already all the wellbore configurations input for us. Thank God, like we don't need to now go again and copy paste or select from the catalog. We've done that exercise. We hopefully have learned how to do that. Now everything is populated for us. We just need to learn how to set it up for ESP. And it's very simple. On the artificial lift method, we have to select, instead of gas lift or rod pump, we select ESP. And before you click on that, I want you to look at this switch here. We have a switch that's called calculate from gauge to sand phase using measured pressures. And if I select ESP, you see this switch is off now. Look what happens if I select ESP, the switch gets activated automatically. So, because as I said, the way we calculate bottom hole pressures once we have an ESP installed is that we take the pump intake pressure of the ESP at the depth at which that pump intake pressure is being measured, and that would be the gauge pressure and the gauge depth. So this here that's asking us for is a gauge depth, which would be corresponding to the pump intake depth or a pump depth. So in this case, we'll input just a pump depth. Let's assume that our pump is at 8,000 feet, for example. And if I run this calculation now, where do you think, if this is the pump intake pressure, where do you think my bottom hole pressure is going to be? Is it going to be below or above that? If I run the calculation now, before you click run, before you calculate the bottom hole pressures, give us your thoughts on that. Let me check the chat. Above. Yeah, perfect. It's supposed to be higher. And we can test that here. Just click calculate. And the reason it will be higher is because it's deeper. The top perforation is going to be deeper than your pump depth. And what we're doing is we're correcting that. And you see in that very small piece of pipe that we basically have between the pump intake and the top perforation, the difference between the correlation is very small. So all the correlations are practically the same. There's a very small pressure drop there, like 400 or 500 psi in this case. One thing we can do is we can go here and say, let's assume the gauge or the pump was a little bit higher. It was not at 8,000, but it was at 7,000 or something, 7,000 feet. Just click that. Then you should be expecting to see a larger difference between those. That's just a natural thing here. Really. That's how we do the calculation in a well. That's on ESP. And we'll now move on to the final well of covering the main functionality of the software, basically. And that's basically this dry gas well. I know that some of you only work with dry gas wells, so hopefully this will be interesting to look at as well. So what I want to show you for a dry gas well, if you go and switch wells from the ESP well to the dry gas well here on the top menu, we're going to go now to this well, dry gas well. We're going to first open the well configuration, just look that everything is looking okay. Now everything should be pre-populated for us. We have the top perforation, bottom perforation, the deviation survey complete there. You can see the plot of the well deviation survey. You can look at the well data. It's basically, this well has been flowing through, and that's basically all the data we have here. And we can just launch the calculation, just calculate bottom hole pressures. We don't need to do any changes here. It's just to look at the results of the calculation for this dry gas well. As Matthias pointed out, when you're working with a dry gas well, then unless you have a lot of water, then you don't expect to see a large difference in the predictions of the different correlations. That's as expected here. There's no big difference, at least. And the one thing that is very relevant for dry gas wells, or for any gas wells, is this liquid loading plot. So you can directly from the bottom hole pressure calculation module, you can click on, instead of this BHP plot, you can click on the liquid loading plot, and that will basically automatically show you gas rate for the well, the total gas rate for the well, including gas lift if you have any gas lift. So it will sum the surface gas rate that you're producing and any gas lift rate that you've provided. We'll sum those two together, and it will compare it to the liquid loading minimum rate to lift from the correlation that you select. So you can select different correlations. In this case, it's comparing to Turner, and you can just see that here. You can change the correlation that you're using for critical rate. You can use Coleman, that many of you are familiar with. It's basically just a multiplier difference with Turner, so that should not be that big of a difference. But we also have introduced two critical rate correlations based on request from one of our clients. They basically are the Nagu and Belford, that should be better at handling deviated wells. So this is the other two correlations, and you can select basically which one you would like to see here on the plot for this diagnostic. One thing that many people asked about when we first introduced the liquid loading calculation was the possibility of changing where in the wellbore we report the liquid loading. You have this setting here where you can basically say that you want the critical rate to lift to be reported at the wellhead, or at the top perforation, or at the end of tubing, or the maximum rate that's found, basically wherever it's found. Or you can also specify a specific depth. Okay, I want it at 6,000 feet. You can say where you want it to be specified, and that you can change. If you change that, you have to just rerun to get the correct values, and that's it. In general, we cover a lot about this liquid loading. You might be wondering, okay, now I am liquid loaded. So what? Like, what can we do? And we cover a lot about that in our nodal analysis course. My colleague Graham Helfrich, he holds those courses. If you want to have it in-house, he'll be able to do that course for your company, specifically in-house. Just send a request to Graham or Matthias, and they'll take care of that. If not, we're also holding a course that's part of the subscription and part of the consortium, and that will be basically held on the 2nd of October this year. So that's also something that you can join. It's more of a public course where all the participants in the consortium and the Whitson Plus subscribers will be available. There we cover a lot more about what to do with liquid loading, how to diagnose it, how to see the effect of changing your tubing, etc. etc. Any questions, Matthias? Anything in the chat?
No, nothing.
Hopefully it's because it's clear, clear as mud, like they say. So the next thing we're going to cover, kind of the final thing where we're going to do any hands-on stuff in the software, that's basically the tuning of BHP correlations to measured gauge data. Okay, and what we want to look at is basically, okay, we have our production data, we have actual measured gauge pressures in the well that we can make use of those to tune the existing correlations. We have correlations that we know that are so predicting the gauge pressures, and we can check how are they predicting the gauge pressures that we're measuring, and then do some adjustment to those so that we can get a better match for the predictions from the correlations to what we actually have measured in the field. The way to do that, we're going to go through a hands-on exercise for that we have a well specifically for that. It's called BHP correlation tuning. So if you click on that, we switch back to the BHP plot. We don't need the liquid loading plot here. We're on the BHP correlation tuning well. And in this case, we're basically assuming that we have gauge pressures like this that are measured in the field. We've measured those. And one important thing about about gauge pressures is that you need to know what your gauge depth is. At which depth are you measuring these pressures? It's different. I think we covered it in the slides. But basically, it's different if you have the gauge at the end of tubing or above that. The correction down to top perforation will be different in that case. So we need to provide, the first thing we have to do is provide a gauge depth for us to be able to do the tuning. So we're going to go ahead and open the well data and go here to the well data, and just everything here should be correct. We have it's a gas lift well with valves, and everything in the configuration should be okay. The only thing that we have to do is provide gauge depth, and in this case, we'll provide the bottom MD. We'll say that the gauge is basically at the bottom of the tubing. If you don't provide it, it actually assumes that that's the case, just so you know, when you're doing the tuning. So you're not in trouble, but it's good practice to remember to provide the depth of the gauge because that's an important parameter in the tuning. So we're going to do that and save. As I said, we go to the well data and provide the gauge depth 7595, as that's the end of the tubing here. And then we're going to calculate bottom hole pressures here, just from the beginning. And as you can see, the correlations, all the correlations themselves, they are falling under gauge depth. And these correlations, all of them, calculated to top perforation, and the top perforation depth is 7828. So that's deeper than the end of the tubing. And that means you should expect those correlations to be above, and that's not happening here. So what we need to do here's a good case for trying to tune those correlations to our measured gauge data. And that you do by clicking on this tuning button on the top right of the screen. Maybe I just, no, it's good. Top right of the screen, you have a tuning button. Go ahead with that. And then we're gonna try to tune each of the correlations. What happens here, I think Matthias covered that, but basically we apply a correction to the liquid holdup and the friction factor. And that correction is applied so that you can find a better fit to the predictions of that correlation to the measured gauge data. So in this case, now you can select which correlation you want to tune and just click on tune. Let's do, for example, the Hagedorn and Brown, and click tune, and then you just say yes. And then it will give you the correction factors, and then you can click on show fit or potentially bad the fit is. Okay, I can do that for the other correlations. Let's say I do it for the Bex-Brill correlation here, and do the same, show fit. Now it will show me also the Bex-Brill. And you can do it for basically, some of them will return just the same values 1 and 1, and that's because that's the best values that it found. But basically, if you look at this, you'll see that in the very early time where there is no multi-phase flow, the data is off. Basically, the calculations are still below the gauge pressures in the very early time where there is no multi-phase flow. So I shouldn't be looking at, any kind of fancy corrections to liquid holdup or anything like that. Instead, maybe I should be looking at something else. In this very early time, you have predominantly water rates. And so one very important thing to do is to make sure that you have a good input of your water densities, which is basically controlled by your water salinity in Whitson Plus. So to try to kind of close this gap, you can go ahead and change the water salinity in the software for the calculation and see if that helps us. Because doing the tuning here, any of the friction factor correlation or the whole liquid holdup correction will not help me. It's just an issue with densities here. I can go ahead and change the water salinity. That you open the well data. There's a couple of places where you could change the water salinity, and it's connected throughout the software. But within the bottom hole pressure calculation, you can do it here. You can edit the water properties. You see that right now the calculation is being done with a water salinity of 0. So if I wanted to get a better match on that early time and those early time predictions, I'd basically adjust the salinity. I could go anywhere. I think I have some slides on that, but anywhere between 30 and 100,000 or 150,000 ppm. And we'll just adjust the salinity now iteratively. We'll just change the salinity, increase it a little bit, and see what values we basically get in the tuning. So we'll focus on the Hagedorn and Brown correlation. And as you see here, we have some references here. For Brian, you have from 35 to 250K ppm as salinity. It would be normal, or these are the values also. Okay, so let's give it a try. Let's just start with the minimum. Start with 35K salinity here. Let's see how that improves my tuning calculation. So I go back to the tuning, and because I have adjusted now the very important parameter, which is the salinity, which is changing my water density, I have to click on tune again. It has to kind of find new tuning parameters, and I see that it's still not as good as I would want it. I would want it to be like we talked about, within 5%, and this is still not close, at least. And we can keep just adjusting the salinity iteratively. Go back, edit the water properties. You can see that when you change the salinity here, by the way, it provides you with what are the density and the viscosity at certain conditions that correspond to that salinity. So here we could go up to like 100,000 maybe. You can see that the density has changed, the water density, and go back to tuning. We're focusing now only on the Hagedorn and Brown. We could do it for all of them, but let's just focus on the Hagedorn and Brown. And you can see that now it's becoming better, the tuning exercise. The Hagedorn and Brown is getting closer, and you could keep adjusting this until you're happy with it. Basically, now that I have my tuning parameters, I can save those and I can calculate bottom hole pressures. Now you see here I have this sign that's telling me that inputs have changed since the previous simulation. And that's basically because my tuning parameters have changed. And if I calculate bottom hole pressures now, it's going to apply those tuning parameters to the calculation. So now I should be in a much better shape when doing this calculation. And one thing that a lot of people like to do or should do with this, you run the tuning on any amount of wells that you have where you have gauge pressures. And then you find the tuning parameters that are sort of the average or the mean tuning parameters that you can find for your set of wells for your field. Then you can go ahead and apply those tuning parameters to all your wells. Basically, if you go here and you change the under your well list, you select the wells that you want, and then you do edit all, and under the BHP category, you select BHP tuning input. You can basically copy paste the inputs from one of the wells into the other wells so that you can apply those tuning parameters. So you're applying the same correction throughout a set of wells that don't necessarily have gauge pressures, but where you know that based on the wells that you have gauge pressures, that you know which correction you want to apply.
Perfect. Mo, just a natural place to take a couple of quick questions that I think was great. One from Cody and one from Mike. I've already answered Mike's question about being able to change water salinity over time. We can't do that right now in the software, but it's something we have on the backlog. And it would probably just be some kind of function that changes. I guess as a function of water cut or something similar to that. But it is true what Mike is saying, that the flowback dominated portion will have different salinity than the reservoir dominated portion.
Yeah, that makes sense actually.
Yeah. Cody, just on Cody's question, the reservoir engineering team is planning to pull the bottom hole gauge data after the initial 90 days. And he assumes that this won't help him pick the right correlation, as all of them will still be overlapping until multi-phase flow. So he thinks that that he would like to recommend to leave them longer to know which correlation to use in the area for this type of well. And that is the right way to think about it. I'm a little bit unsure exactly what area it is. Like maybe 90 days you're below the PSAT, but if your GVARs is, they're basically constant on the relative ratios are constant, you probably would like to see a little bit more changes in those relative ratios over time if you'd like to do that assessment. So I totally agree with that. But Mo, maybe you have something to add there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100% with that. And if you have it, which hopefully you have connected to Whitson Plus, your data, then you can just look at it. You just get the data, and as you start getting the data every day in Whitson Plus, you can calculate the bottom hole pressures automatically every time the production data gets updated, and then you'll start seeing, okay, now I'm starting to get into the area where the correlations are spreading without any tuning. Just before you do any tuning, just the basic calculation, you'll start to see when it's the right time, when you start to see the correlations that they're starting to differ, and that should help you decide.
Yeah, that makes sense because you don't even have to pull the gauge for that. So you're kind of doing it without knowing the gauge, but at least you can see when they're spreading for your well and fluid system and stuff.
Just based on the correlation, yeah. Which is what you're going to do with the tuning, anyways. When you're going to do tuning, you're comparing how the correlations are doing, regardless of the gauge. You're comparing it to the gauge, and that's why you can see that spread, have the data already.
Yeah. Chris is also asking about the difference between the gauge depth and top perf, if that's an issue in this example that we're looking at right here. And that's very important that the tuning is, of course, done at gauge depth for consistency. But the calculated values that we're looking at here, they are, so this plot right here is at gauge depth. But the bottom pressures that you like to use as an input to nodal, RTA, flow material balance, numerical models, etc., those are at sand phase. So the calculated properties in this plot right here. So not the gauge pressures, of course, but everything else is at sand phase or top perf.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chris. Good question. So I was thinking, Matthias, instead of taking a break, would try to maybe just go through it, and I have just this final thing about the mass upload, and then we finish a little bit earlier. Everyone gets maybe half an hour of their days extra.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. The last example you're just showing us a demo, right? Or
yeah, that's just a demo for just a quick walkthrough from my end. One thing that is important, very important, and I remember when we first introduced the tuning, we had a lot of customers that were trying to do that. So if you're new to Whitson Plus, you might be trying to do that as well. Matthias touched upon it, but if you have gauge pressures that are coming from an ESP, then those gauge pressures are unfortunately useless for tuning your correlations. And that's because the gauge pressures are here. I hope you can see my mouse. Maybe I'll have a laser pointer there. The gauge pressures are measured here. And the correlation, the multi-phase flow correlation, is able to do the calculation from wellhead down to the inlet of the ESP, but it doesn't model the delta P across the ESP. Trying to tune those correlations to ESP intake pressures, it doesn't make any sense. Just basically, just don't do it and avoid it. If you have, I think someone mentioned one time that they had pressures at the outlet of the ESP, then you could use those for tuning. But those would be at the outlet of the ESP, not the pressure, the pump intake pressure like we usually have. Okay, very good. So I think that's most of or all of what we wanted to cover in the course. For those of you that are not familiar with kind of the faster way to do this, you might be thinking, oh, this is like very slow. Mo is extremely slow at doing this, step by step, copy pasting each value or entering each value manually. That's not the reality of how things have to be done. I just did that on purpose for the sake of the example. 99% of people will be doing a mass upload, which is basically a file, an Excel file that will contain all the data that you need for the calculations. And I want to show you how you can access that. And later we'll talk also about the API towards the end of the course. Just in the next 10 minutes, I'll try to cover that as well. So what most people will do when they want to upload the wells, they'll do just a mass upload. And the mass upload will basically contain all the data for multiple wells, production data, wellbore configurations, etc. The way you can do that in the software is you go to the well list, you click on the mass upload at the top right of your well list, and here you have different templates for doing the mass upload. If you want to use the Whitson template, you can download the Excel template from here, but you can do it in EnerDeck, Prism, Dirling Info. You have different templates. Some of them are only for production data. Some of them are for the whole data set, including wellbore configurations. We also have the examples here, which is where I'm going to show you an example where you have already pre-populated data sets from the SPA data repository and some of internal demos or wells at Whitson, where we have pre-populated the whole mass upload data set for you. So you can click on download here. That will download that for us. We'll open that just to see basically what's contained in there. Hopefully it will not be so. My Excel is taking forever to open these days, so we'll see. Do that. Very good. So here you'll see that you have 4 main sheets in the Excel file, and those sheets contain very basic information. The first one is just a well header. We call it like the well header data. Your well name, your reservoir pressure, your reservoir temperature, The only thing that's really required is your well name, and then you have also some kind of attributes that you can provide, like your reservoir height, etc. So those are like the well header data that you can provide here, and then you can do the provide the production data for each of the wells, where you provide the well name and the corresponding production data with the date for the different wells. You have also the deviation service provided here for all the wells, and the wellbore data that we went through. Here we have basically 11 wells, where for each of them you have multiple configurations. Like this well has 5 configurations, and each configuration has its corresponding inputs with casing, tubing values, with which lift method it's using, etc., etc. So what I can do, I can take this file and directly drag it, populate it with my data, and drag it directly into the software here and upload it. You can also, if you just want to upload the example, you could just click on the upload button here next to it, and that will basically launch automatically the uploading without you having to download the Excel file and then upload it. Just upload the example data set, and I want to show you that. Oh, something happened here. Let's see. Yeah, I'll show you just the example data set here. So this is the one well, and for the bottom hole pressure calculation, you see that this well has 5 configurations, and the 5 configurations have been input. That's the same 5 configurations that we have here for this well. See that we have the use from date, different dates to be used for each of the configurations. That's what you have. See the dates automatically populated there, and the different artificial lift methods that we have picked. That's basically much easier way to do what we did today. If you have all the data, you gather it into one shot, and you upload the whole thing. The other very important way that people use is the API. Basically, the external API. Most of the customers, most of you guys that are in this call, I'm sure, have connected through the external API, which basically allows you to upload production data on a daily basis. Whenever you get an update on your internal database, it gets populated into the Whitson database automatically. Then it launches calculations automatically, like the bottom hole pressure calculations. And then it also fetches the values of those calculations so you can populate it back into your internal database. Some of you also have, instead of using the external API, you're using Snowflake or something like that for sharing your databases, and then we're using that for doing the work for you, basically, where we populate the database and we run the calculations and fetch the data. That's basically most of the ways we connect. And if you don't have the external API set up yet, it's free. There's nothing that you need to add to your software subscription. So basically, you're missing on a very good thing to add to your software for automated production data updates and automated bottom hole pressure calculations. So I really strongly recommend you to touch base with Matthias there about setting it up. All right, I think that's all we wanted to cover here. There's no questions or anything else. Happy to open the floor for questions.
Awesome. If you guys have any questions or anything else, just feel free to reach out to Mo and I. We're always available, or support@whitson.com is always your friend. The recording will be distributed a little bit later today, so you'll get that shortly as well. Thank you everyone. Have a good rest of the day.